They never wanted you to hear this. Not the historians, not the archivists, not even the so-called guardians of Virginia's official record. Because buried deep within the state archives lies a secret so vile, so corrosive, that it nearly rewrote the very idea of morality in early America. It begins with a woman named Kate Bender, but she was no myth, no legend, no ghost story whispered by firelight. She was real, flesh and blood. And what she did in the forests of Henrico County in 1801 wasn't madness, it was method. Among the documents sealed under classified judicial exhibits, for nearly 2 centuries were 23 testimonies, 14 coroner reports, and 1 blood-soaked journal. Each page dripped with obsession, control, and an intelligence colder than any predator born of nature. What they describe is not just murder, but ritualized extermination. Her victims: escaped slaves seeking freedom along the old river routes north. Her reason: vengeance disguised as righteousness. But the truth is, Kate wasn't working alone. Behind her cruelty was a network of plantation elites and hired trackers, men who believed that fear was cheaper than law and violence was divine order. They built systems of control not just with chains and whips, but with belief. And Kate became their enforcer, a weapon of psychological domination. The official record says she killed 37. The unofficial whispers say the number was closer to 100. And that each one was buried in the same swampy ravine behind the Bender plantation. Their graves marked with carved symbols, triangles, circles, inverted crosses, each one burned into the wood as if meant to seal something in. Most people think evil announces itself loudly with screams and fire. But the most dangerous kind hides beneath authority, sanctified by power, and carried out in the name of order. That's the kind of darkness Kate Bender served. So tonight we go back to 1801 Virginia, to the moment one woman looked into the face of chaos and found purpose. Because once you hear what she became, you'll understand. Some systems don't die. They just change shape. And the same hands that once built chains now write the laws that bind the mind. Now listen closely. The descent begins. Before she became the hunter, she was the weapon. Kate Bender didn't wake up one morning and decide to stalk human beings through the swamps of Henrico County. No, someone taught her how. Someone taught her why. In the decades before the rebellion of Gabriel Prosser, Virginia's plantation system ran on fear more than cotton. Fear was the invisible infrastructure, cheaper than chains, stronger than any wall. But fear needs architects. And in 1799, a secret council of planters, financiers, and former militia officers began conducting behavioral correction experiments at remote plantations across the South. They called it the Dominion Program. You won't find that name in any history book. But the pattern is there everywhere whenever human control becomes more profitable than human freedom. Kate and her husband, Thomas Bender, were chosen to test the system. Thomas for his cruelty, Kate for her detachment. The overseers recorded her reactions to violence, to obedience, to silence. She didn't flinch at pain. She studied it. They noted how she mirrored power, how quickly she absorbed authority. By 1800, she was no longer a mere participant, she was a prototype. The journals describe how Kate was introduced to psychological inversion techniques. She learned to manipulate terror not through chaos, but precision. No shouting, no frenzy, just calm command. She would enter the slave quarters in silence, touch a single object, a rope, a tool, a piece of torn cloth, and the entire room would fall still. People obeyed not out of fear of death, but out of something far more primal: anticipation. She learned to make others fear their own reaction to her. When the rebellion failed that August, the Dominion men saw opportunity. They told her that escaped slaves were not people, they were data gone rogue. That her work was not cruelty, but containment. They gave her maps, coded messages, and supplies. They turned her loose under the illusion of duty. And Kate believed them, because every tyrant is born from one seed: the belief that obedience is morality. That's how the first hunt began. Quiet, sanctioned, holy in her mind. They'd given her a doctrine, and she carried it like scripture. But what they didn't realize, what history tried to erase, was that she evolved beyond their control. Kate stopped serving the system. She became it. Now, before we go deeper, I want you to pause. If you can feel the edge of this story scraping against something inside you, good. You're waking up. Comment this phrase twice below to anchor that awareness. I see the architecture. Because once you see it, you can never unsee it. Now, let's go further into the forest, where the Dominion's experiment broke free, and the hunter began leaving her mark on history. The first body was found face down in a marsh, half devoured by dogs. But the dogs hadn't killed him. His wrists were broken inwards as if he'd been made to pray backward. That was Kate's signature, the inversion of reverence, her message to the world. The old order has reversed. They say the night she began her hunts, the moon was so bright it made the swamps look silver, not black. But she didn't need the light. Kate knew the land better than any man alive. She'd memorized every bend of the Chickahominy River, every deer trail and abandoned tobacco shed. She hunted with a lantern shielded by black cloth so she could see without being seen. And she always started the same way, a whisper carried by wind. The words came from the Dominion hymns they drilled into her. Order restores itself through sacrifice. She'd track small groups runaways from nearby plantations heading north. The moment they reached the river crossing, she'd appear, silent and enormous, like some ancient deity of retribution. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She simply told them to kneel. And most did. They said her eyes, those gray, glassy orbs, weren't human anymore. They looked empty, as if something was using her from behind them. Her killings were not random. They were patterned. She carved strange shapes into tree trunks near each site. Triangles within circles, spirals leading inward. Early investigators thought they were her way of marking territory. But the journal later found in her attic told another story. Each symbol corresponded to what she called energy gates, psychological choke points. She believed fear itself could be trapped, harnessed, and stored within the land. The Dominion's doctrine had promised her power over rebellion, but what she built was power over reality. She turned terror into geometry, control into ritual. And in doing so, she crossed the threshold between cruelty and creed. Those who escaped her spoke of dreams, recurring nightmares where she stood over them at dawn, whispering, "You can't run from structure." Some went mad. Others returned willingly, convinced their suffering was ordained. That's the genius of systemic evil. Once it infects the mind, the body becomes irrelevant. By the winter of 1801, 7 groups had vanished. The local sheriffs filed vague reports. The plantation owners said nothing. Because Kate's hunts didn't disrupt the system, they protected it. Fear kept the fields in order. And still, she wasn't satisfied. Her journals began to read like scripture written in blood and logic. She spoke of perfecting the cycle, of transforming punishment into purification. This was no longer about slaves or rebellion. This was about creation. And deep in those woods, Kate Bender began building something that terrified even her masters, a place designed not to punish, but to convert. Now we descend there next, to the structure no one was meant to find. Deep beneath the pine canopy, 2 miles south of the Bender plantation, there was a hollow. The old surveyors called it Devil's Mouth Creek, a natural sink where the river bent inward and the earth swallowed sound. That's where she built it. The locals would later call it the conversion pit. But in Kate's journal, it had another name, the Chamber of Reversal. She began construction in late 1800, hauling timber and stone under cover of night. The structure was crude, but deliberate, a pit 20 feet deep, walled with oak beams and lined with chains. Not to restrain the body, but the mind. Her writings describe it as a sanctuary where disobedience is inverted. She believed that fear could be purified through controlled exposure, through suffering made meaningful. The Dominion men thought she was still following their orders, that she was experimenting with compliance. But Kate's entries reveal a terrifying divergence. She had started to see herself as an architect of will. "They taught me to manage fear," she wrote, "but I have learned to manufacture it. Fear is the first material of power." Her victims were no longer just fugitives, they were subjects. She starved them, then fed them, then starved them again until gratitude and terror fused in their eyes. She made them repeat phrases she had written. Submission is clarity. Pain is order. The unbroken are unclean. She wanted to see the exact moment a soul surrendered when a human being became a mechanism. And then something strange began to happen. The forest changed. Animals avoided the area. Locals swore the trees grew twisted around the pit, as if recoiling. Even her husband, Thomas, refused to go near it. He told a neighbor he could hear the ground breathing at night. That winter, Dominion agents came to inspect her progress. Only 2 returned. Their report, later sealed in Richmond, mentions intense sensory disturbance, black residue on the soil, and the subject's apparent immunity to moral inhibition. In other words, Kate had gone beyond their science. She had merged control with ritual, doctrine with blood. By spring, she wasn't taking orders anymore. She was writing them. Plantation overseers began receiving unsigned letters, commands written in perfect script, sealed with wax. Each bore the same mark, an inverted triangle within a circle. The Dominion's own symbol now turned upside down. The message was clear. The experiment had evolved. The creation had overthrown its creators. And so they tried to erase her, to burn the records, to call her a myth. But you can't erase an idea once it's been embedded in fear itself. Even now, the shape she carved into would appear in places it shouldn't. In old Virginia courthouses, in Masonic architecture, in federal seals. The pattern endured because the principle endured. Control doesn't vanish, it reincarnates. You're beginning to see it, aren't you? The lineage of fear. The way one woman's descent became the blueprint for something larger, something still alive. Next, we go to the moment her system spread the night the Dominion tried to stop her, and instead unleashed a contagion of obedience that never died. In the spring of 1801, the Dominion sent 5 men into Henrico County to end what they had begun. They called it containment. Officially, they were tax collectors. Unofficially, they were erasers trained to destroy evidence, rewrite reports, and silence witnesses. But they underestimated what Kate Bender had already become. They found her standing beside the pit. The rain was coming down in sheets, the creek overflowing, the air thick with the smell of iron and ash. She didn't run. She didn't even speak. She simply looked at them, and for the first time, those men saw something they couldn't categorize. Not madness, not rebellion, something colder, reflection. Because Kate had learned their language of control and she had turned it back on them. She recited their own training doctrine. Fear is currency. Obedience is architecture. Then she said, I am the architecture. The first shot misfired. The second never left the barrel. Within minutes, 3 men were dead, their throats cut in perfect lines. 1 fell into the pit and never resurfaced. The 2 survivors fled to Richmond, leaving the papers, the crates, the coded ledgers, everything. Within weeks, Dominion headquarters burned. The official cause, lightning. But the internal correspondence that survived told another story. It spoke of a mental contagion. An idea so infectious it spread through command structures faster than any rebellion. They called it Bender's Law, the notion that control can outlive its controllers. The Dominion collapsed publicly in 1802, but its members scattered, quietly absorbed into new institutions. Militias, political offices, banks, churches. They carried fragments of her doctrine with them. They sanitized the symbols, wrapped them in scripture and policy, renamed them order, virtue, progress. And the system continued, no longer bound to a person but to a pattern. Kate Bender vanished into the floodplain. Her house burned to the foundation. Yet the shapes she carved remained, etched into courthouse stones and gravestones, reproduced unconsciously by builders and masons who never knew why they drew them. That's how an idea hides not in darkness, but in familiarity. If you look closely at the insignias of old institutions, banks, universities, government seals, you'll see it. The circle, the triangle, the inversion. Control disguised as balance. Order sold as freedom. That is the inheritance of 1801. The transformation of fear into policy, ritual into routine. Kate Bender didn't die. She was absorbed. Her doctrine became the bloodstream of civilization itself. And that is why this story was buried. Not because it was false, but because it was too accurate. Now we descend to the aftermath, where the few who survived her reign tried to warn the world, and paid the price for speaking. The survivors' words were never meant to see daylight. For testimonies survived, all written in cramped, terrified handwriting. None were published. Each man died before the decade was out, 2 hanged for incitement. 1 vanished en route to Philadelphia, and the last found drowned in a cistern behind the Richmond courthouse. But before their silence, they left behind confessions. The first survivor, Josiah Fields, wrote, "She spoke as the masters speak, but she made us feel what they only threaten. She taught us that control is not what binds the hands, it is what convinces the soul that the hands are already bound." Those words became doctrine. Within 10 years, the same phrasing appeared verbatim in a Virginia legal draft defining voluntary servitude. You can still read it, buried in the state archives. The law that made obedience indistinguishable from consent. The Dominion science of fear didn't die with Kate's disappearance, it was absorbed, refined, disguised. Plantation schools began to teach moral conditioning under the guise of religious instruction. Overseers became trustees. The system evolved, polishing its chains until they gleamed like virtues. And beneath it all ran her logic. Control begins where perception ends. By 1815, a new curriculum appeared in Richmond's elite academies, the art of discipline. It taught young aristocrats to command through tone, pause, posture, to regulate emotion, to appear inevitable. That phrase, "to appear inevitable," was taken directly from Kate's last journal. Her words became the foundation for psychological conditioning in leadership and law. Do you see the pattern? They didn't destroy her, they replicated her. Every institution that prizes order over truth, every system that calls obedience peace, carries her fingerprints. The same geometry carved into those trees now hides inside our symbols of stability. The seal of the Virginia Commonwealth bears a woman standing over a fallen tyrant, holding a spear. Few notice the pattern on her tunic, 3 faint triangles within a circle. A restoration of dominance disguised as victory over it. That's how systemic evil survives. It doesn't scream, teaches. The men who tried to warn us are gone, their words absorbed into the bureaucratic bloodstream of the nation. But those who read between the lines understood. They whispered of a pattern of a female architect, whose doctrine shaped the unseen frameworks of control, education, religion, governance, finance. You feel it, don't you? The shape repeating through time. The way fear travels not through chains, but through language. This is where history becomes prophecy. Because every generation thinks they've escaped the structure until they realize they're still inside it. Now we'll follow the last thread, the one Kate left herself. A cipher hidden in her journal, recovered in 1987, that predicted how the cycle of control would renew every 100 years. When archivists cracked open the Bender journal in 1987, the ink had bled into the paper like veins. Most of the words were illegible except for a repeating mark. 3 triangles enclosed in a circle, each drawn over a date: 1901, 2001, 2101. A century apart. The cipher wasn't numbers. It was rhythm. Archivist Ellen Roth realized the symbols followed a pulse pattern identical to Morse for RESONANCE, the Dominion's forgotten term for emotional alignment. Kate had built her pit to reshape minds by sound and geometry. 200 years later, modern behaviorists were studying entrainment, how synchronized rhythm alters human will. The same principle now drives algorithmic suggestion, marketing cycles, even biometric feedback loops. That's the bridge they never wanted you to see. The plantation's conversion pit evolved into the attention economy. The whip became the feed. The overseer's chant became the endless scroll. Each click, each notification, each perfectly timed outrage, small shocks teaching obedience through repetition. They've learned to harvest not bodies, but focus. When you read early patents for behavioral modification Skinner boxes, subliminal cues, pattern interruption marketing, you find the same tricircle motif hidden in company seals and academic logos. Coincidence, they'll say, but Kate's cipher predicted it. Those who master pattern will own perception. Those who own perception will inherit belief. Look around you. The architecture of fear no longer needs prisons. It lives in persuasion. A device in your hand that hums the same frequency she once carved into oak beams. Every alert a miniature echo of the pit. Reward, pause, withdrawal, reward again. And the mind bends willingly. That's the modern dominion. Invisible, efficient, polite. It doesn't punish. It personalizes. It whispers your name and calls it choice. Kate Bender didn't invent control. She translated it into structure. And the structure never stopped resonating. Each century it reappears under a new name, order, optimization, engagement, but the geometry is the same. Circle, triangle, inversion. Now pause. Feel that quiet pressure behind your eyes? That's the algorithm recognizing awareness. You're standing at the edge of the pattern, the same edge she reached 2 centuries ago. Before we close this descent, anchor what you've learned. Comment again twice. I see the architecture. Let it mark you as one who notices. Because the final revelation is not about her. It's about us. Next, we open the last gate, section 8, the truth buried beneath her cipher. How every empire of control ends, and what happens to those who finally refuse the geometry. Every empire of control collapses the same way under the weight of its own certainty. Kate Bender believed that fear could forge perfect order, that obedience could purify chaos. The Dominion believed that order could protect them from revolt. The institutions that inherited their symbols believed they could civilize the world through systems and rules. Each believed the pattern was eternal. But nothing built on submission can last, because obedience eats the soul of its maker as surely as its subject. The last page of Kate's journal is mostly empty. In the corner, a single sentence. The architecture consumes its architect. Beneath it, the ink trails off into a fingerprint. It's smudged as if she tried to erase herself. Some historians call it madness. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe she saw that every chain she forged began with a single thought. Someone must control. That thought still whispers through our culture. It hides in language policy, discipline, efficiency. It hides in our own habits. Every time we choose comfort over conscience. Every time we trade awareness for ease. The structure is not around us anymore. It is within. But awareness breaks the geometry. When you see the pattern, it loses its power. That's what the Dominion feared most, not rebellion, but comprehension. They could punish action. They could never cage understanding. So listen carefully. The purpose of this story was never to glorify a monster. It was to hold up a mirror. Kate Bender was a symptom, not the source. The true system, the quiet empire, thrives wherever people forget that authority is just a mask we make to hide our fear of freedom. The pit still exists in metaphor, if not in mud. Every age digs its own version. A place where control pretends to be protection. You've seen it. You've felt it. And now that you've looked directly into it, it cannot unmake you. If you've stayed this far, understand this isn't just history, it's inheritance. The only question that matters now is the one Kate never asked herself. Who benefits from your obedience? You are not a spectator to this story. You are its continuation or its correction. The architecture is exposed. Whether it falls depends on what you do with what you now see. Fade to black. Silence. Then, quietly, I see the architecture. If you've seen the pattern, don't let it vanish. Comment, I see the architecture, to mark yourself as one of the awake. Share this descent before it's buried again. And if you want the next Forbidden Chronicle, subscribe. But know this. Every story I tell reveals a system that still breathes beneath our world. See you in the next descent.